Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. That's Captain John Parker to his Minutemen on the morning of April 19th, 1775 at Lexington Green. And so this part of Massachusetts became hallowed in the history of the American Revolution and the events which would alter the course of history. Not far from that road which once carried Minutemen and Redcoats was another route of a different sort of Minuteman, the Lexington Branch of the Boston and Maine Railroad. We're here in Bedford, Massachusetts, one of its busiest locations. On August 25, 1846, the Lexington and West Cambridge Railroad was opened between the Fitchburg Railroad's main line in West Cambridge and Lexington Center. In 1867, the name was changed to the Lexington and Arlington Railroad, and in 1870, the Lexington and Arlington was acquired by the Boston and Lowell Railroad. By the 1870s, the line had reached here, Bedford, Massachusetts, and pushed on westward towards Reformatory Station in Concord, Massachusetts. On August 31, 1877, the Billerica and Bedford Railroad, the first 2-foot common carrier narrow gauge railway in America, began shuttling passengers and freight between its namesake towns. The Billerica and Bedford only operated for a brief 6-month period, but in that window of time it interchanged with the Boston and Lowell here in Bedford, Massachusetts. Today, only one original Billerica and Bedford building survives, but it has quite a fascinating history. We're here inside the Bedford Freight Depot with Bill Dean, and he's going to give us a little information about the history of the organization and the building.
You know, the building where we are, the Bedford Freight House, was originally the engine house for the 2-foot narrow gauge Billerica and Bedford Railroad that operated from 1877 and 78, and then later formed the starting equipment for the Sandy River Railroad in Maine. The freight house has a long and colorful history. It went from being an engine house to becoming a Boston, Maine freight house after the narrow gauge was abandoned. Mm-hmm. It passed in the 1940s to a feed and grain dealer. Yep. Became the property of the local VFW. Sure. And eventually was a sandwich shop, and still survived into the 1990s when the town of Bedford purchased it back from the private owners, and it began the restoration to the condition it's in today. Mm-hmm.
With all the trackage in Bedford now consolidated by the Boston and Maine Railroad, Bedford continued on as an important junction between the two railroad lines in town. The Lexington Branch, which came in from Boston, continued east and north of the station to meet up with the New Hampshire Division main line at North Billerica. The other line in town, the Reformatory Branch, left the Lexington Branch just before the station and passed west of the station, heading out to Reformatory Station in Concord. Until after World War II, all trains on the Lexington Branch were powered by the Boston and Maine's famous 1300 and 1400 series moguls, with 2 major exceptions. The last train from Boston to Bedford, which arrived at 7 p.m., was almost always a 442 Atlantic type. The other exception was the train that came into Bedford at 6 p.m., rush hour. It became so heavy that the Boston and Maine swapped out the usual mogul with a heavier 280 consolidation in the 2300 or 2400 series. By this time, all passenger trains on the line terminated at Bedford, and passenger service on the Reformatory Branch had ended in the 1930s. After World War II, much heavier 462 Pacific-type steam locomotives began to see passenger service on the Lexington Branch, with the track being strengthened and the Y track at Bedford lengthened to accommodate the larger power. Interestingly, the Lexington Branch was perhaps the only line on the Boston and Maine with named commuter trains. The practice of naming a passenger train was usually reserved for high-speed, long-distance, luxurious passenger trains, not the mundane daily commuter jobs. However, both the Paul Revere and the Patriot, no doubt named after the area's revolutionary history, plied the rails for several years. With Bedford being a busy suburban terminal, and locomotives laying over overnight, it became necessary to have watchmen to keep the fires running in the engines, especially in the wintertime. Long hours for these watchmen were basically as follows. They would leave Boston on the Saturday afternoon train at 2 p.m., go to Bedford, and stay with the engines until the first engine left for Boston on Monday morning. Then it was back to Bedford on Monday afternoon on the 4:30 p.m. train, and stay until the following morning, and so forth throughout the week, until the long stay over the weekend came up again. It was a lonely job that involved the watchmen sleeping in the engine house and doing their own cooking. Freight service on the Lexington Branch for many years consisted of a noon freight, which departed from Boston in the morning, arrived in Bedford around noontime, and headed off for Billerica and Lowell. It would then return to Boston via the New Hampshire Division main line and repeat the process the next day, hauling anywhere between a handful of cars to over 20 or 40, depending on the need. In the late 1940s and 1950s, diesel power began to appear on the Lexington Branch, at first in the form of EMD GP7 diesels. In the mid-1950s, passenger duties passed on to the Boston and Maine's world-famous Budd rail diesel car fleet. Towards the end of passenger service, only a single round trip a day with a single Budd car was required. Ownership of the line passed to the MBTA in 1976. It was an ending with little fanfare. After over 100 years, passenger service on the Lexington Branch between Bedford and Boston came to an abrupt stop when a snowstorm stranded a Budd RDC at Bedford Depot on January 10, 1977. The MBTA rescued its equipment soon thereafter, but by then the agency had decided to end commuter rail on the branch for good. Freight trains last ran beyond Bedford on both the old Reformatory Branch to Concord and the old Billerica and Bedford in 1962. After 62, Bedford became a total dead end, with freight service into town running on an as-needed basis. The very last train on the Lexington Branch was January 31st, 1981, but by that time, the trains were really not going beyond Arlington. Around this time, the branch was embargoed to allow the construction of the MBTA's Alewife Red Line station in West Cambridge, which took up part of the Lexington Branch's eastern end. In 1992, the Lexington Branch began conversion into the Minuteman Bikeway, and on January 28, 1998, the railroad returned to Bedford in a manner of speaking. Bill's going to give us a little history on the Budd car, 6211, which found a home here in Bedford.
Yeah, thank you. The 6211 was built by Budd in 1955, ran all over the B&M system, of course by the mid-50s, concentrated mostly in Boston commuter service with the other Budd RDCs. It turns out it did see regular service out to Bedford. In 1995, when the Friends of Bedford Depot Park was beginning to lobby for the creation of a historic park, very early on the group had its eye on a Budd car. Mm-hmm. And at that time the MBTA had 3 left in its possession, all in derelict condition in North Billerica. This was one of them. It was the one with the best exterior, and so it's the one that the town chose to take the MBTA up on its offer for any of the 3 for $1. Turned out that it was, as I said, one that operated actually regularly out to Bedford, so that was a nice coincidence there. Mm-hmm. The car was moved to Bedford in 1998 after a couple of years of preparation. Its cosmetic restoration began the year before and took until about 2008 actually. So it was about an 11-year effort to take the car from heavily vandalized, derelict condition to what you see today, which is pretty nearly its original appearance as it came out of the factory.
Mm-hmm. And the nice thing about the Budd cars is that the B&M had the largest fleet of them in the world, so there's probably nowhere else you can get a real feel for the original B&M RDC fleet than here at Bedford.
The organization that operates the freight house as a welcome center, as a service for the town, is the Friends of Bedford Depot Park. Mm-hmm. It was formed in 1995 by Jim Shea and a handful of others to encourage the town to create a local railroad history park, and to do so by acquiring a rail car. Time went on, the goal expanded to actually reacquiring the freight house building and also the original depot. both of which are frame buildings that dated from the 1870s and had miraculously survived into modern times. So the Friends of Bedford Depot Park has been around since 1995, and its original purpose was to basically lobby for the creation of the park. That was successful, and by 1999, I think it was, the town had acquired the buildings and also had title to the rail car that's now been cosmetically restored. It took years after that for the site work to be done, for the renovations to the buildings to be done, and essentially it all came to a near sort of complete appearance in around 2016, actually. So it was a long process.
Certainly a while, yeah.
The Friends of Bedford Depot Park operates the freight house as a welcome center. Volunteers man it on weekends when people are available, that is. And food and beverage proceeds go to the town fund, which pays for maintenance of the buildings. Funds also come from rentals to 4 different organizations within the depot itself. And so for Bedford taxpayers, the Depot Park complex is actually entirely self-supporting.
It's wonderful. Yeah, if you're in the area or you ride the Minuteman Bikeway, be sure to stop in and visit the Bedford Depot here on weekends.